By the time the kitchen clock blinked 2:03 a.m., the refrigerator had begun its soft hymn, and the house smelled like coffee I wasn't supposed to drink after midnight. On the counter lay a neat row of evidence. A campus visitor pass I'd pulled from the minivan's floor mat, a receipt for 2 lavender lattes from a cafe that pretends it's attached to the university for community outreach, and the thing that made my hands shake, an overdue notice from the city library stamped with a date that hadn't happened yet. Not late, not please return, but due, next Wednesday, and next Wednesday was yesterday. That's when I decided to do something a younger, dumber version of me would call revenge, and an older, church-going version would call discernment. I logged into the university's public safety portal because, welcome to America, we love transparency when it's inconvenient for somebody else. And I watched the feed from a camera nearest the glass corridor between the library and the student union. I watched the future rewind. The frame glowed at night like a fish tank, the kind where you can't decide if the fish are tranquil or trapped. There she was, my wife, the person my mom still calls a real keeper, floating into the frame wearing the navy sweater I bought her last winter because our heater is dramatic. The alibi had always been lyrical. I'm at the library, like it was a sanctuary with stained glass sunlight and a choir that sang the praises of study. But my screen showed something else. A boy, fine. Not a boy. I'm not running for office. A college student with the posture of someone who thinks he invented shoulders, sweeping into the hallway with a backpack that probably cost more than my first car. He saw her before she saw him, and when she did see him, her mouth did a thing I recognized from the early years, open enough to laugh, closed enough to keep the laugh private. They hugged like people who had practiced hugging. She tilted her head. He leaned down, and I swear the camera flickered the way cheap lights flicker when the universe wants you to say the word betrayal out loud, just to make sure you still know how your own voice sounds. Here's the thing. If you've lived long enough in a suburb with a homeowners association, your mind is already wired for conspiracy. You've had meetings about mailbox paint codes. You followed a speeding teenager to his driveway just to memorize which house has the drum set. You've decoded the neighbor's passive-aggressive yard signs like they were messages from a rival nation. So of course my brain, this great American caffeinated little motor, built a wall of theories. Maybe she was mentoring him. Maybe this was some weird service learning thing where middle-aged women pretend to understand TikTok and college students pretend to read hardbacks. Maybe the library was a code name for a study group on toxic love where infidelity has footnotes. Maybe I was living in a simulation and the overdue notice was a glitch, a spoiler from the script supervisor who took a long lunch. But the footage kept playing, and the footage did not care for my need to be funny or to be dignified. It marched forward, timestamp by timestamp, and then it advanced into that tender choreography people do when they think the world has forgiven them for their vows. His hand moved like it knew the small of her back better than it had a right to, and the camera, conspirator that it is, panned a fraction, as if the lens itself were rooting for infidelity to get a close-up. I paused. I rewound. I hit slow motion and watched betrayal become a measurable thing. Not a vibe or a rumor, but an artifact. A kiss delivered in a corridor named after a donor whose portrait would probably be deeply disappointed in both of them. I closed the laptop, then opened it again, because grief and anger are nosy and insist on one more look. On the fridge, our son's karate reminder flapped under a magnet from a Myrtle Beach shop that sells funny t-shirts about marriage we used to think were cruel. In the hallway, the dog lifted his head and put it back down, bored with my crisis. Upstairs, she slept with the slow, soft breath of someone who had learned to schedule her sin between real life and my lack of imagination. I did the American man thing. I justified, I itemized, I searched for a story in which I was not the fool. But the only story that fit was the one I never wanted, to say cheating wife in my throat, to let it scrape its way out like a slur I didn't choose. Then the overdue notice glowed again under the kitchen light, a minor absurdity that felt like a prophecy. Due, next Wednesday. Not return on time, but due. as if the cosmos had stamped a return date on the version of my life where I believed in the library. That's when the parody in me, the guy who makes everything a joke to survive, shook hands with the detective in me, the guy who prints screenshots and names them with timestamps like 2025, 08, 21, 22, 14, 03, KISS, PNG. Operation Dewey Decimal, I scrawled in a notebook, because if I couldn't have dignity, I could have a code name. I would find the patterns. I would make the map. And if I discovered that my marriage had been checked out to somebody else, I would decide whether to fight for a renewal or fine her to the last cent in a courtroom called my kitchen table. Revenge waited like a cheap bourbon in the pantry, too available, promising courage it couldn't deliver. Family stared back from the fridge in smiling photos that now looked like stock images of a lie. I didn't sleep. I watched the feed until dawn and made a list titled Things the Library Can't Loan Back. 7 days earlier, I was just the guy with the best attendance in his own life, the kind of man who knows trash day and remembers to sign field trip forms. The first odd note was small, a text at 6:12 p.m. Running late at the library, big project, don't wait up, followed 5 minutes later by a charge at Bean and Bound, a coffee shop that gives senior discounts to people who still call college the university. The second odd note arrived with a smell, a cologne that wasn't mine and wasn't hers, something like cedar trying too hard. The third was anecdotal. She laughed at a meme about adjuncts and then couldn't explain why it was funny, which is how I learned there's an entire subculture of students who roast their professors so efficiently you can feel the burn through the Wi-Fi. I drove to campus with a plan that would later read like parody. Infiltrate the library as a concerned citizen, blend with the freshmen taking photos in hoodies, and casually ask the circulation desk if they'd seen my wife because, she told me to come get the book she left on hold, and I forgot the title, Isn't Marriage Hilarious? The circulation kid wore a name tag that said Matt in a font meant to discourage pranks. He told me to check special collections because people study there when they're serious, which felt like a deeply personal accusation from a 19-year-old with a skateboard keychain. Special Collections lives in a corner of the building that believes itself to be an art museum. Glass cases cradle old maps and handwritten letters. The silence there is not polite. It's devout. If cheating had a chapel, this would be its foyer. I saw her name on the sign-in log, inked in her perfect teacher handwriting, the kind that makes third graders believe in penmanship. And there, below her name, was someone else, D. Ortega. I didn't know him yet, but his letters leaned forward like they were already late. I took a photo of the page and wondered if an alibi could be elegant. Outside, the student union was buzzing with what America exports best, possibility. A band was doing an acoustic cover of a song from my era, a sweet insult. Flyers screamed about improv nights and free pizza if you talk about climate. I hung by a corkboard feeling 40 and undercover. That's when I saw him. Not because he was remarkable. No, the remarkable thing was the ordinariness America wraps around people when they're about to break your life. Ball cap, campus hoodie, joggers a little too fitted, the swagger of someone perpetually spotted in reflective surfaces. He passed me, and the cedar cologne hit like a punchline I wasn't ready to laugh at. D. Ortega. I knew it was him the way you know a song from its first chord. He carried a book on metaphysics and a tote bag that declared, "The future is a library," which is either the most earnest or the most sinister sentence printed on cotton. I trailed him to Bean and Bound, where the barista spelled his name D-E-E-E because names are hard at volume. He ordered 2 lavender lattes, and I pretended to browse for a pastry I didn't want. Then she arrived in her navy sweater and that coat that makes her look like an apology. She did the arm touch thing, 3 fingers, quick, claim stake, while he did the "I lifted weights once" grin. They sat in the corner under a poster that said, "Community is a verb," and I sat behind a ficus like a man who had lost the plot. Their conversation was nothing and everything. He complained about a philosophy professor who weaponized the Socratic method, and she said grown-up things about boundaries. They spoke in soft bursts like people building a bridge of plausible deniability plank by plank. Then he reached into his tote and pulled out a blue library card and said, "Your name looks good on this." And my heart misheard it as, "Your name looks good on me." And honestly, there's not enough therapy in our zip code for that sentence. Here's where the conspiracy deepened. My watch buzzed with a Life 360 notification. Our son had arrived at karate, and I saw her location blinking at City Library, which is not the same thing as University Library, but which we had both decided could be used interchangeably because marriage is an ongoing negotiation of shortcuts. The map said she was where she said. My eyes said she was somewhere else. And my brain said, "Welcome to toxic love, where technology becomes a co-conspirator." I screenshot everything like a tourist on a bad vacation. The cups, the tote, the hands hovering, the smile she reserves for Christmas morning. And once, years ago, for me outside a hospital when our daughter finally slept. I didn't confront them. People imagine heroics at moments like that. They rehearse speeches that end with applause and the state granting them a medal. Instead, I went home, stood in our driveway with the porch light taking 5 seconds too long to turn on, and experienced what I can only describe as a slow snow globe of betrayal settling over my lawn. I built a little wall in the garage the way men do, a pegboard and some hooks, and the attention to detail that no clips you out of pain. Operation Dewey Decimal. Evidence goes here. Labels matter. I told myself jokes because the alternative was a howl, and American men have limited venues for howling. When she walked in at 10:47 with City Library air on her hair, I kissed her forehead like a colleague and thanked her for working so hard for our family. She said, "Anything for us," and I thought about how infidelity and comedy both rely on timing. By Monday I had turned into that guy, the one with a conspiracy wall who buys red string and actually uses it. I mapped timestamps from the university feed to the city apps recently viewed. Every library night corresponded to a campus open mic night, a visiting author lecture, a student government debate. If cheating could cosplay as civic engagement, it would look exactly like my wife's calendar. I borrowed a friend's alumni pass and went back to campus with a hoodie that made me look like a dad trying to look like a student. In the quad, some performance artists were pretending to be clocks. They moved their arms in slow circles while a speaker read from an essay called The Myth of Linear Time, and I laughed out loud in a way that made a freshman glance at me like I was a manifestation of his fear of aging. D. Ortega was at the edge of the art, taking photos like he'd invented noticing. When my shadow crossed his, he turned. You know how in movies the rival always recognizes the protagonist, some animal instinct, some ancestral drumbeat? That didn't happen. He saw me as another campus ghost, and it was both mercy and insult. He was younger, but not youthful in the way that makes you want to bless people. He had that borrowed maturity some students get from majoring in philosophy. They know words like teleology and say them like they invented hunger. On impulse, I asked him for directions to special collections, and he pointed with the confidence of a tour guide. "If you're into primary sources," he said, "the letters from the 1970s are mad. People used to narrate their lives to each other like podcasts." And I, who had become a narrator sentenced to his own life, said, "Yeah, mad." Inside the library, I checked the sign-in sheet out of habit. There was her name again, and his, and a time written in the same ink. The joke wrote itself so hard it hurt. She finally had a study buddy who studied her. I found a seat near them under a portrait of a benefactor who looked like he hated both modernity and joy. They sat with one laptop open to a document titled Shame in the American Family. Maybe this was a class project. Maybe I had misread everything. Maybe I was an anecdote in their paper about how suspicion is the national pastime. That's when his knee brushed hers under the table with the intimacy of a habit. She didn't flinch. She didn't even look. It was muscle memory. The university clock chimed a time my marriage didn't recognize anymore, and I had an epiphany that felt like science fiction. In every marriage, there's a secret calendar running parallel to the real one, a series of due dates and renewals and quiet fines. We'd missed ours, and the universe had stamped us overdue. It's corny, it's true, and it's the sort of metaphor a jury of neighbors would nod at. I took pictures because America believes pictures more than it believes pain. The plan for confrontation arrived like a pop song, catchy, a little shameful. There was an open mic night on Wednesday in the Student Union's Black Box Theater, the kind of place where people confess to strangers under good lighting. I wrote a piece in my head in which I play the fool and then unmask the magician, and imagined the audience giving me that hush. People give tragedy disguised as stand-up, revenge, but make it art. But when Wednesday came, the theater manager announced a theme: Love in the Age of Transparency. Perfect. I signed up as guest. The list was long, with kids who wanted to be future famous. And in the green room I met a girl writing a poem about her dad's double life who made me want to go home and sit with my daughter's math homework until the numbers apologized. When my turn came, I stepped onto the stage and did not perform. I froze. All my lines fell into an invisible well, and what came out instead was a question. How do you tell the truth without breaking the world you built to hold it? I asked, to a room that thought I was a professor trying out sincerity. Then I talked in circles about family and toxic love and betrayal, and how cheating is less like a lightning strike and more like a weather pattern you ignore because the forecast bores you. I didn't name them. I didn't say cheating wife out loud because it felt like summoning a demon, and yet I could feel the weight of that phrase on my tongue like a coin I might swallow. When I walked off, D. Ortega was in the back, arms crossed, face tilted with the kind of pity young people give you when they think you finally learned that life is math, and you never did your homework. He put a hand on my shoulder, a gesture I've reserved for friends and enemies, and said, "That was real." And I said, "You have no idea." Then I did the un-American thing, the thing our sitcoms warn us against. I invited him to coffee. We sat with our cups between us like two diplomats negotiating a ceasefire, neither side intended to honor. I asked him what he liked about her, and he said she was awake, which is a sentence you're allowed to say before you turn 25. He talked about infidelity as rebellion against a culture that choreographs love until it becomes a TikTok dance, and I thought about our mortgage and the dog's vet bill and the way my wife had fallen asleep on my arm as if my bones had been custom made. He said, "You're not angry," and I said, "I'm choosing my weapon." He didn't get it. That's fine. He will. I didn't expose them at the open mic, not because I'm noble, but because public humiliation isn't revenge. It's theater, and our life had already become a show I couldn't stand to watch. Instead, I set the kitchen like a courtroom, exhibits on the counter, timeline on the legal pad, 2 mugs neutral as Switzerland. When she came home from the library, I asked her to sit. The dog put his chin on my knee like he'd passed the bar exam. I began in the middle because linear storytelling is for people who don't look at security footage. "I listened to you say library, and I believed you," I said, "because that word has always held us." Then I learned it was an address for a place I couldn't follow. I showed her the photos, the sign-in sheet, the lattes. I watched her face do the math of collapse, shock, defense, bargaining, the speedrun of guilt. She said words that have their own aisle in the American emotional superstore. It wasn't supposed to happen. I didn't know how to tell you. I felt invisible. He made me feel awake. She said family like a lifeline. I said betrayal like a diagnosis. She said it wasn't about cheating. It was about being seen. I said it's always about cheating once the contract of us is torn. We were both right. We were both ridiculous. When I asked why a college student, she said something honest and terrible, because he didn't know the worst stories about me yet. The line hit me with a mercy I didn't want. I remembered once, years ago, telling her that my favorite part of us was that we knew the bad chapters and stayed. Now, apparently, staying had become a suffocation. We sat in the soft hum of the fridge and tried to untangle toxic love from garden variety disappointment. She cried. I did the American man thing where I looked at the table and felt the heat behind my eyes and refused to let it become weather. She said she would end it. She said she already had. Then the overdue notice on the counter flashed under the light. Due next Wednesday. And the universe, shameless comedian that it is, offered me a punchline. You returned a book on time, but not yourself. I didn't say it. Growth is sometimes silence. Instead, I asked if she would tell our kids, or if she wanted me to. She said she couldn't bear to be the villain in their bedtime stories. I told her villains are just protagonists we stopped rooting for. She asked if I wanted revenge. I told her revenge fantasizes competence. Reality delivers paperwork. Divorce is a system. Grief is a marathon. Infidelity pays out in installments you never budgeted for. We chose, for now, a pause instead of an ending. It's not noble. It's survival. Counseling, because America loves a therapist the way we love a sale. Separate rooms, because proximity is a liar. Rules about phones and locations. And, this is the most embarrassing part, book club together on Thursday nights at the actual city library, where a retired librarian named Janet maintains order like a benevolent dictator. We sit in plastic chairs and talk about novels where people make worse decisions than ours. And sometimes I look at her and see the college student's reflection fade like a watermark behind her face. If this were a satire with a neat bow, I'd tell you I executed the perfect revenge. Leaked a confession, destroyed a reputation, moved to a condo with an infinity pool, and learned to surf the algorithm of happiness. If this were a parody, I'd list 10 tips to survive a cheating wife with grace and a new wardrobe. If this were science fiction, I'd time travel back to the moment we started treating each other like furniture and make us both press pause, or I'd step into the corridor where the camera panned and interrupt their choreography with a monologue that saves us all. But this is just America at 2:03 a.m. A man at a kitchen table, a woman across from him, a notice stamped with a date that makes no sense, and a dog who will love us both regardless of our genre. Sometimes I still open the campus feed, not to spy, but to remind myself that what we record is never the thing itself. The footage shows a kiss. It does not show the 12 months of silence that made the kiss feel like oxygen. It shows the tilt of a head. It does not show the emails where I said, "I'm running late," too often to count. It shows betrayal. It does not show the daily kindnesses we dropped like pennies in a jar until the jar was empty. This is not an apology for her. It's an indictment of the way we sleepwalk in marriages and then gasp when someone else wakes us, the way we use words like family as walls instead of gardens, the way we call cheating an accident when it's 1,000 micro choices in a row. Next Wednesday arrived. We returned the overdue book together. Janet stamped it with a thunk that sounded like a judge's gavel. On the walk home, we talked about nothing. Trash day, karate, whether the mower needed a tune-up, and then about something. What forgiveness costs when the receipt says no returns. We are not fixed. We are at best paused on a frame where two people remember how to breathe in the same house. If we continue, we'll have to build new shelves. For truth, for the parts of us we exiled, for the tiny rebellions that only become crimes when we hide them. If we end, we'll have to build new rooms. For the kids' laughter to echo without splitting, for our separate futures to hang their coats without apology. Either way, I know this. The library is no longer an alibi. It's a place where we go, together or apart, to read the lives we meant to live and decide, with whatever courage we have left, what we check out next.